Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. This week in the Americas, we look at Colombia, where twin attacks have triggered a major government security operation. In Europe, the Middle East and Africa, we cover Ukraine's intensifying aerial campaign, Israeli airstrikes in Gaza, and debates over post-war plans, and Botswana's declaration of a nationwide public health emergency amid critical medical shortages. And in Asia-Pacific, we assess the impact of Typhoon Kajiki in Vietnam, violent protests in Indonesia, and nationwide far-right demonstrations planned in Australia. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where in Colombia, twin attacks have triggered a major security operation. On August 21st, at least 6 people were killed and more than 60 were injured when a truck-borne improvised explosive device detonated on a street outside the Marco Fidel Suarez Military Aviation School in Cali. Authorities stated that all of the victims were civilians. A second truck-borne IED failed to detonate. Earlier the same day, a police helicopter was shot down in the department of Antioquia in northern Colombia, killing 13 officers and injuring several others. Reports indicate the helicopter was brought down using small arms fire and drones. The attacks have been attributed to 2 separate dissident factions of the now-defunct leftist guerrilla group, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC. Authorities have linked the Cali bombing to fighters loyal to Iván Mordisco, leader of the Estado Mayor Central, or EMC, the largest and most powerful FARC offshoot. The EMC is now primarily involved in drug trafficking and armed activity across western and southern Colombia. The helicopter downing has been attributed to a different EMC cell operating in Antioquia. While both groups operate under the EMC banner and trace their origins to FARC, they reportedly function as semi-autonomous factions following the collapse of the 2016 peace agreement. In response to the twin attacks, President Gustavo Petro, who has previously favored peace talks over military operations, has vowed to confront the threat from armed groups. He announced plans to officially designate EMC, the Segunda Marquetalia, and the Clan del Golfo as terrorist organizations under a so-called Junta del Narcotráfico. On August 22nd, Defense Minister Pedro Sánchez stated that the government will launch Operation Sultana to neutralize what he called the terrorist threat. The operation will involve deploying search block units to Cali and the surrounding areas. These elite units of the National Police are tasked with capturing or killing high-value targets. Now for our assessment. The Cali bombing is the deadliest incident in a major Colombian city since hostilities intensified in early 2025. It follows a series of attacks in the Cali region in June, though those earlier attacks were mostly limited to municipal areas where armed groups hold greater influence. The detonation of a truck bomb outside a military base in a relatively central part of Cali almost certainly shows that armed groups have the capability to strike high-value targets and project violence into urban centers under government control. It also likely indicates a willingness to accept high civilian casualties in pursuit of their objectives. President Petro's decision to designate armed groups as terrorist organizations is highly likely a decisive shift away from his earlier total peace agenda, which prioritized dialogue and reintegration over military confrontation. The move is likely intended to delegitimize FARC dissidents' claims of being genuine political actors and to reduce popular support for these groups. This shift, combined with the launch of Operation Sultana, will almost certainly lead to intensified security operations focused on capturing or killing high-value targets such as Iván Mordisco. It also likely signals the suspension of any meaningful peace negotiations in the near term. However, armed groups in Colombia remain highly fragmented and decentralized, with fluid leadership structures and deep ties to local communities. This makes them resilient and difficult to dismantle through conventional military operations. The same fragmentation has also complicated peace efforts, as no single leadership can credibly represent or enforce agreements across such a decentralized network. The Petro administration is now likely facing dual challenges: intensifying counterterrorism operations while also attempting to revive meaningful negotiations under increasingly difficult conditions. Colombia's armed groups are likely to respond to intensified government operations with more attacks on police and military targets, aiming to deter further pressure. The attack in Cali may also signal a growing willingness to shift violence from traditional rural strongholds into urban areas in order to maximize psychological impact and undermine the government. This change in strategy will almost certainly increase the risk of civilian casualties. Future attacks may also expand to include non-military targets, such as shopping centers, bars, transport hubs, and public events, as has been seen in previous periods of internal conflict in Colombia. Now we turn to Europe, Middle East, and Africa, where Ukraine has intensified its aerial campaign as large-scale Russian strikes resume. In recent weeks, Ukrainian forces have stepped up attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, primarily using long-range attack drones. At least 10 oil refineries have been partially disrupted, accounting for an estimated 17% of Russia's refining capacity. For example, on August 23rd and 24th, drones struck the Novatek gas processing complex in the Ust-Luga port in Leningrad Oblast, as well as the Syzran oil refinery in Samara Oblast. The strikes have contributed to sharp increase in gasoline prices, up between 38% and 49%, depending on the type, along with shortages and long queues at filling stations. These conditions have forced Russian authorities to revise export plans and, in some cases, impose export bans. The success of Ukraine's long-range campaign comes as the country further strengthens its aerial capabilities. On August 21st, President Volodymyr Zelensky unveiled a new domestically built cruise missile called the Flamingo, with a reported range of up to 3,000 kilometers and a 1,150-kilogram warhead. In addition, the White House has approved the delivery of 3,350 extended-range attack munitions to Ukraine. This low-cost, air-launched weapon is described as a hybrid between a cruise missile and a bomb, with a range of 240 to 400 kilometers. However, on August 23rd, reports emerged that the Pentagon has quietly been preventing Ukrainian forces from using the Army tactical missile systems to strike targets inside internationally recognized Russian territory. This policy also believed to limit the use of UK-provided Storm Shadow cruise missiles, which depend on US intelligence support for targeting. Overnight, on August 27th and 28th, Russian forces launched a large-scale, layered wave of aerial attacks against Ukrainian cities, with Kyiv the primary target. More than 20 locations in the capital were hit. The combined strike package reportedly included over 600 attack drones and decoys, along with more than 30 ballistic and cruise missiles, making it the largest attack on Kyiv this month. As of August 28th, at least 13 people have been reported dead and dozens more injured. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Ukraine's growing long-range strike capability, achieved primarily with domestically produced attack drones, is highly likely to increase pressure on Russia's war economy. Beyond attacks on military infrastructure and industry, Ukraine's intensifying campaign against Russian oil refineries poses a serious threat to one of Moscow's most critical wartime efforts. These strikes also coincide with US secondary tariffs on India for importing Russian oil, compounding the economic pressure on Russia. Manpower has been Russia's greatest advantage on the battlefield. The Kremlin has been able not only to sustain, but also to expand its ranks without resorting to politically costly mass conscription. This has almost certainly been made possible through the considerable financial incentives offered to new recruits. While the Russian economy has been hit by international sanctions, it has so far avoided a strategically decisive impact on its war effort. This resilience is largely due to continuing, and even expanding, economic relationships with key partners such as China and India. Moscow continues to derive substantial revenues from oil exports. However, domestic fuel shortages caused by Ukrainian strikes, along with the revision of export plans and, in some cases, export bans, are likely to pose a major long-term strategic challenge to the Kremlin. This threat is likely to grow as Ukraine continues to develop its long-range strike capabilities. It is almost certain that the Pentagon's restriction on Army tactical missile system strikes inside Russian territory is another reason Kyiv is prioritizing rapid domestic production of such systems. The Flamingo FP5 cruise missile is reportedly being produced at a rate of 1 per day, with the goal of reaching 7 per day by October 2025. If that target is met, Ukraine will likely be able to stockpile enough FP5s to then launch mass strikes against targets deep inside Russian territory. This emerging capability, combined with attack drones and other long-range weapons, will likely overwhelm, overstretch, and successfully penetrate Russian air defenses. With its claimed range, the FP5 could comfortably reach strategically vital high-value targets, such as the Yelabuga drone factory in the Republic of Tatarstan. At the same time, Russian forces have almost certainly resumed their previous high intensity of long-range strikes against Ukrainian cities. From late May through August, combined Russian strike packages escalated dramatically in size, with records being broken week after week. This surge has almost certainly been enabled by increased Russian weapons production, which has grown considerably since the start of 2025. However, while aerial attacks against Ukrainian cities continued, their scale was relatively reduced from early August until after the Alaska summit. This was highly likely an effort by Moscow to ease pressure from Washington, but it also likely indicates that Russia was stockpiling attack drones and missiles. The large-scale aerial assaults of August 20th to 21st and August 27th to 28th highlight that the threat to Ukrainian cities far from the front lines, particularly Kyiv, remains at its highest level since the early stages of the full-scale invasion. Moving on to Middle East, where in Gaza, Israeli strikes have killed journalists and health workers as debate continues over post-war plans. On August 25th, Israeli forces carried out a double strike on the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis. The attack killed at least 20 people, including 5 journalists working for Reuters, the Associated Press, and Al Jazeera, and 4 health workers. The second strike was recorded, prompting significant international outrage. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu described the strike as a tragic mishap. The strikes in Khan Yunis were part of a broader wave of Israeli airstrikes across Gaza, which have recently intensified as a prelude to the planned Israeli Defense Forces ground offensive on Gaza City, aimed at occupying the area and eliminating the remaining Hamas fighters there. Israeli military channels have also stated that they plan to issue evacuation orders for all remaining civilians in Gaza City, relocating them to southern areas of the Strip, most likely the Al-Mawasi humanitarian area. On August 26th, Israeli forces, including armored units, entered the northern Ibad al-Rahman area of Gaza City. In Washington, U.S. Special Middle East Envoy Steve Witkoff announced that the administration is developing a very comprehensive plan for the post-war administration of Gaza. He also told reporters that Washington expects the war to be settled by the end of 2025. Now for our assessment. The strike on Khan Yunis follows an earlier attack in Gaza City that killed 5 Al Jazeera journalists. The incident has drawn significant condemnation, and it is highly likely to spark protests in the short term across major European and North American cities, including New York, London, and Paris. The planned offensive on Gaza City has already proven highly controversial, both in Israel and abroad. it is opposed by Israeli hostages and missing families forum, who argue that the operation will endanger the roughly 20 captives still believed to be alive. It is highly likely that further international and domestic unrest will follow developments in the Gaza Strip. U.S. statements suggesting the war could end by the late 2025 likely reflect the administration's fatigue with the conflict, which polls show is becoming increasingly unpopular among American voters. It remains unclear whether Envoy Steve Witkoff's new framework will deliver a breakthrough in the deadlock between Israel and Hamas in the short term. In May, a US-backed plan that had broad Israeli support was rejected by Hamas. On August 18th, after Tel Aviv announced its plan to occupy Gaza City, Hamas reversed it and said it would accept the proposal. However, Tel Aviv rejected it, with Prime Minister Netanyahu opposing the phased release of the remaining hostages outlined in the plan. It is highly likely that the Israeli government believes Hamas is under extreme pressure and may be forced into greater concessions. For this reason, it likely prefers to begin the Gaza City offensive before agreeing to any ceasefire arrangements. Moving on to Africa, where Botswana has declared a nationwide public health emergency amid critical shortages of medicines and supplies. On August 25th, President Duma Boko declared the emergency after acknowledging the collapse of the national medical supply chain, which has left hospitals and clinics short of medicines and essential items such as dressings and sutures. The president also announced 250 million Botswana pula, about $18.5 million in emergency funding for medicines. The distribution will be overseen by the military. Now for our intelligence team's assessment. The declaration of a public health emergency follows earlier warnings from the Ministry of Health. On August 4th, the ministry announced that non-urgent procedures were being suspended and that Botswana was critically short of medicines used to treat hypertension, diabetes, cancer, asthma, and eye conditions, as well as sexual and reproductive health. While the exact cause of the shortages is unclear, President Boko has blamed the state procurement agency, Central Medical Stores, accusing it of driving up drug prices in the country. Botswana's finances are heavily dependent on the international diamond market, where it is the top producer by value. With the current global downturn in the diamond trade, it is highly likely that the government is struggling to fund its health initiatives. In 2024, diamonds accounted for roughly 1/4 of Botswana's GDP, 1/3 of government revenue, and around 80% of exports. For decades, Botswana has relied on diamond revenues to fund its public healthcare system, which provides services to citizens at little to no cost. Primary care, preventative services, and many treatments are widely available through clinics, health posts, and mobile units. The Trump administration has also cut funding to Botswana, adding further strain on the medical sector. While the emergency funding package may temporarily ease supply shortages, it is unlikely to resolve the country's deeper vulnerabilities, including procurement challenges, heavy reliance on diamond revenues, and reduced international support. Given these issues, the public health emergency is likely to remain in place, with chronic shortages persisting. This will likely increase the prevalence of both non-communicable and infectious diseases, including HIV/AIDS, with more than 20% of Botswana's adult population estimated to be living with the virus. Any disruption to antiretroviral treatment could have severe consequences for public health, leading to increased morbidity, rising transmission rates, and long-term setbacks in HIV/AIDS management, an area where Botswana has previously made significant progress. If medical shortages persist in the long term, there is a realistic possibility that Botswana's healthcare system will become overwhelmed. Growing public dissatisfaction could translate into unrest if people believe the government is unable to guarantee access to healthcare. The suspension of U.S. aid to Botswana has already been linked to scaled-back NGO activity, disrupting HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria programs. If the US is seen as partly responsible for Botswana's emerging health crisis, there is a realistic possibility of growing anti-US sentiment in the country. Turning to Asia-Pacific, where Typhoon Kajiki has made landfall in northern Vietnam, bringing heavy flooding and widespread disruption. After passing the Philippines as a tropical depression on August 22nd, the storm intensified into Typhoon Kajiki by August 24th, south of Hainan, China. With maximum recorded wind speeds of 176 kilometers per hour, businesses and public transport were forced to close in Hainan's resort city of Sanya. Kajiki then tracked west, making landfall on Vietnam's north-central coast near the city of Vinh on August 25th at typhoon strength, before weakening into a tropical disturbance. More than 500,000 people were evacuated in anticipation of the storm. Kajiki triggered heavy flooding and landslides, damaging more than 10,000 homes and offices, while blackouts left 1.6 million people without power. Vietnam's capital, Hanoi, also experienced significant flooding. As of August 28th, the death toll stands at 8, 7 in Vietnam and 1 in Thailand, where 8 provinces were affected by flooding and landslides. Now, our assessment. Typhoon Kajiki's impact underscores the ongoing threat of tropical cyclones in late summer, the peak of the Northwest Pacific typhoon season. Although this year's season has been projected to be 15 to 20% below the 30-year average, it remains highly likely that further typhoon-strength storms will develop in the region in the coming weeks. The potential development of La Niña conditions later this year, though unlikely, would enhance Northwest Pacific typhoon activity and could trigger an increase in abnormal late-season storms. In addition to raising the average severity of tropical cyclones, climate scientists warn that global warming is causing major storms to increasingly occur outside their traditional timeframes. In 2024, Taiwan was struck by 2 typhoons between late September and early November, including Typhoon Kong-ray, the first typhoon in the island's history to make landfall after mid-October. A country's disaster resilience, shaped by factors such as preparedness, infrastructure quality, urban planning, and emergency response capacity, remains the most critical determinant of a natural disaster's impact. Vietnamese authorities conducted mass evacuations ahead of Typhoon Kajiki, likely drawing lessons from the catastrophic impact of Typhoon Yagi in August and September 2024. These measures almost certainly prevented far greater casualties. Staying in the region, where Indonesia has seen violent student-led protests over parliamentary privileges and austerity measures. On August 25th, demonstrations were staged outside the parliamentary complex in Jakarta, with protesters demanding cuts to what they view as excessive salaries and housing allowances of MPs. Reports indicated that some MPs were receiving more than 100 million rupiah per month, about $6,150. Riot police were deployed, using tear gas and water cannons to disperse crowds attempting to breach the parliamentary compound. Protesters also threw rocks and other projectiles at police. More than 300 people were reported arrested during the initial protest. Further protests were organized for August 28th, planned to take place across all 38 provinces of Indonesia. These demonstrations are part of a separate movement, organized under the banner of HOSTEM, Eliminate Outsourcing, Reject Low Wages. They were planned in advance of the August 25th student protests. The movement is being led by the Labour Party, the Coalition of Trade Unions, and the Confederation of Indonesian Trade Unions. Their demands include better working conditions, an end to outsourcing and layoffs, stronger anti-corruption measures, and tax reforms. The main protest is expected outside the House of Representatives in Jakarta, with around 10,000 workers originally expected to march from surrounding areas. Simultaneous demonstrations are also planned in major cities including Surabaya, Medan, Bandung, Semarang, Makassar, and Banda Aceh. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Protests in Indonesia have increased under the new presidency of Prabowo Subianto. In February, student-led demonstrations broke out over President Subianto's austerity measures, which introduced major budget cuts and expanded the military's role in civilian government. These protests soon drew support from civil society groups and unions, evolving into a coordinated nationwide movement marked by repeated clashes with police. Economic hardship from rising living costs, high inflation, and government spending cuts has almost certainly increased dissatisfaction with the Subianto administration, particularly among Indonesia's youth, who have been disproportionately affected. The revelations of MPs' large expenses, coinciding with a major austerity program, have almost certainly deepened public resentment. Parliamentary allowances are estimated to be about 10 times the minimum wage. This development will likely act as a catalyst for broader anti-government demonstrations and could help unite student-led protests with wider movements supported by trade unions, opposition groups, and civil society. The convergence of student protests with organized labor and union-backed demonstrations will likely lead to larger, more frequent, and more coordinated protests across Indonesia. Many of these demonstrations are expected to take place outside government buildings and will almost certainly result in clashes with security forces, mass arrests, and the use of tear gas and other dispersal tactics. Social media has played a pivotal role in organizing and coordinating protests. The government has repeatedly blamed online platforms for spreading what it calls disinformation. Authorities have already summoned companies such as Meta and TikTok, threatening fines, temporary suspensions, and even outright bans if content moderation is not improved. However, any move to restrict or suspend online platforms will almost certainly be seen as government overreach aimed at curbing free speech. Such actions would likely fuel further public anger and intensify anti-government sentiment. And finally, we turn to Australia, where the country is bracing for nationwide far-right protests set to coincide with pro-Palestine demonstrations. Nationwide anti-immigration rallies, organised by far-right groups, are scheduled for August 31st under the banner March for Australia. The protests are due to begin at 12 noon local time. According to literature circulated on social media, demonstrations are planned at multiple locations: Sydney's Belmore Park, Melbourne's Flinders Street Station, Brisbane's Roma Street Parklands, Perth's Supreme Court Gardens, Adelaide's Rundle Park, Canberra's Regatta Point, Darwin's Civic Centre, Townsville's Anzac Memorial Park, and Cairns Freedom Park. And now our assessment. The rallies come against a backdrop of rising anti-immigration sentiment in Australia. However, turnout is unlikely to match the level of publicity the demonstrations have received. Protest-aligned media outlets have suggested that tens of thousands may attend, though this figure is highly likely to be exaggerated. Local police forces have nonetheless prepared for potentially large crowds. The demonstrations are likely to result in violent confrontations between rival protesters, despite almost certain efforts by police to keep groups apart. Counter-protests are already being organised. For example, anti-fascist groups have planned a simultaneous counter-protest outside the State Library in Melbourne. The August 31st protests will also coincide with weekly Sunday pro-Palestine demonstrations, further raising the risk of disruption. On August 24th, tens of thousands joined pro-Palestine marches nationwide. Earlier in the month, on August 3rd, protesters shut down the Sydney Harbour Bridge during a demonstration. There is a realistic possibility of targeted violence, with community leaders warning immigrant communities to stay indoors during the rallies to avoid potential harassment. Thomas Sewell, leader of the neo-Nazi National Socialist Network, has attempted to claim leadership of the March for Australia and has issued calls for mobilisation, further increasing the likelihood of violence. Sewell was arrested on August 22nd over an alleged assault during a National Socialist Network march in Melbourne's central business district earlier in the month. It is likely that his supporters will use the March for Australia to also protest his arrest. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solaceglobal.com. Thank you for listening.